All right, I will say good morning. Let's begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Adar, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating all of the shir and drushos this month in memory of Paul's grandparents, Dina Bas Pesach and Zechariah ben Zechariah. We thank our Daf Yomi. We hope in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamas will have an Aliyah and the family a Nechama. We thank our Daf Yomi sponsors, our sponsors for Parak Arvei Pesachim, Moshe and Chavi Abramson, in dedicating the Parak in the Schus of Refuah Shalema for Daniel Meir ben Chana. We thank Binyamin Fleischman for dedicating the shir today as a Schus for Refuah Shalema for Rina Esther Bas Yafa Gita. May she have an immediate and complete refuah. And Menashe and Bracha Ephron for dedicating the shir today in honor of the birth of two granddaughters, Batya Zimrat Ephron to Noam and Leah Ephron, and newborn Ephron girl to Ben Sion, and Alana Ephron, Emeretz Hashem, I guess to be named B'Sha'at Tova U'Metzlachos. And to thank Rabbi Tzvi and Malki Shor for dedicating the shir today in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Rabbi Shor's father, Rabbi Daniel ben Rav Avram Leib Shor. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an Aliyah and the family a Nechama. And we'll see with that, let us begin. We have another incredible daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Kuf Zayin 107. And we are picking up in Eretz Hashem on just the last line of Kuf Vav Amud Beis. Actually, I think we left off maybe 3 lines up from the bottom. Amar Rav Yosef Amar Shmuel. So we're now going to get into the very interesting discussion which we began a little bit quickly at the end of yesterday's shir. Amar Rav Yosef Amar Shmuel, Tam Eino Mekadesh, Tam Eino Mavdil. So we get into a very interesting discussion now about what happens in the event if a person goes ahead and eats before Kiddush or eats before Havdalah. Does the act of eating before Kiddush or Havdalah essentially preclude me from making Kiddush or Havdalah on that day or on that night, and require me to push off Kiddush or Havdalah to the next day or night? The idea being able to just understand how this works is, for example, let's say I eat on Friday night before Kiddush. So Kiddush is a din of occurring before Achila. So maybe there's a concept that if I eat before Kiddush on Friday night, I really should delay Kiddush until Shabbos day, and make a proper Kiddush before Achila. Same thing with Havdalah. If I eat before Havdalah on Motzei Shabbos, maybe I should wait until Sunday morning to go ahead and make Havdalah before the act of eating. So this is the machlokes. Honor of Yehuda Shmuel, Tam Eino Mekadesh, Tam Eino Mavdil. So Shmuel says, if you eat, you don't make Kiddush. When we say don't make Kiddush, means you wait till the next day to make Kiddush. And if you ate before Havdalah, you wait until the next day to make Havdalah. Rabba Amar Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel, Tam Mekadesh v'Tam Mavdil. So we'll say it's a machlokes in what Shmuel said. Machlokes in Shita Shmuel. So the second opinion, Rabba said in the name of Rav Nachman, that according to Shmuel, Tam Mekadesh, Tam Mavdil. Even though you're not supposed to eat before Kiddush, if you did so, halacha l'maisa, you could still make Kiddush afterwards. Even though you're not supposed to eat before Havdalah, if you did so, you could still make Havdalah afterwards. Top of Kuf Zayin. Amar Rava. So Rava says, what's the halacha hilchasa? Tam mekadesh v'tam mavdil. Both say the halacha is that even if you ate, you still go ahead and make Kiddush, and even if you ate, you still go ahead and make Havdalah. Furthermore, umishalo Kiddush berev Shabbos, mekadesh v'holech kol yom kulo ad Motzei Shabbos. Furthermore, we see another concept which we've already established, which is that halacha l'maisa, if you did not make Kiddush on Erev Shabbos, which means if you did not make Friday night Kiddush, you missed it for whatever the reason, intentionally or unintentionally, you have the ability to make up that Kiddush over the course of the duration of Shabbos. We saw that statement already in the Shulchan Aruch. Similarly, the Mishalo Hivdil, b'Motzei Shabbos, someone who did not make Havdalah, on Motzei Shabbos, Mavdil v'holech kol ha-Shabbos kulo, has the ability to make up the Havdalah during the rest of the week. Also, we saw that in yesterday's daf, and we saw rest of the week really means until when? Until Tuesday night. Right? Tuesday night, again, we learned that concept from Gittin. The week is interesting how we learn out from Gittin. The week is divided up into 2 parts, right? There's the week following Shabbos, the week before Shabbos, the week following Shabbos, or the days following Shabbos are Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. The week days before Shabbos, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, if a person did not go ahead and make Havdalah on Motzei Shabbos, they can go ahead and make Havdalah until Tuesday night. Ameimar. And I both say that statement, what the Gemara just said, just summed up a nice amount of halacha l'maisa that we've covered over the last 2 days. Ameimar Pasach la lahashmaisa de Rava b'hailishna. Amemar had a different version of Rava's statement. In his statement, in his version went like this: Amar Rava, Hilchos Hatam Mekadesh Tam Mavdil. So we'll say, so far so good. It's the same thing. So Rava once again is saying, although you shouldn't eat before Kiddush, if you did so, you could still make Kiddush afterwards. Shouldn't eat before Havdalah, but if you did so, you can make Havdalah afterwards. Similarly, Mishalo Kiddush Berev Shabbos Mekadesh V'Alach Kalayom Kulo. So far, same thing I will say. If you did not make Kiddush on Friday night, you have the ability to make up that Kiddush over the duration of Shabbos. Here's where this version is different. Mishalo Hivdal B'Matzei Shabbos Mavdil V'Holech Kol Hayom Kulo. If a person did not go ahead and make Havdalah on Matzei Shabbos, they can make Havdalah over the rest of the day. In this version, Rava is limiting the amount of time that you can make up Havdalah, through Sunday. And again, his logic is, Kiddush and Havdalah are apparently, they're bookends, right? They're bookends, right? What Kiddush is to the beginning of Shabbos, Havdalah is to the end of Shabbos. So just like Shabbos, so to speak, has its whole day to make it up, so to make up Kiddush, so to Havdalah will have something. I will say again, we know halacha l'maisa, we adopt the first approach, not the second approach. While it is true that you have the entire Shabbos to make up Friday night Kiddush, and I will say again, remember, when we say make up Friday night Kiddush, what are we referring to? Which part of Friday night Kiddush? The bracha of Mekadesh HaShabbos, right? The actual bracha of Kiddush. Remember, we saw in Mishnah Berurah yesterday, if you forgot to make Kiddush Friday night, and you make Kiddush Shabbos day, remember, you're not saying Vayichulu, right? Remember, we saw that, because remember, Vayichulu represents the Ribono Shel Olam's creation, or cessation of creation, which is a din in Friday night. You're just making the bracha of Mekadesh HaShabbos. That's the duration of Shabbos, but we adopt the first version of Rava, that if you go ahead and you missed Havdalah on Matzei Shabbos, you can make it up until Tuesday night. Beautiful. Says the Gemara, Amrile Mar Yenuka Mar Kashisha Bereid Rav Chisda Rav Ashi. Well, this is interesting. So Mar Yenuka and Mar Kashisha were the sons of Rav Chisda. So we'll say, this is interesting. Just as an aside, there's an interesting machlokes about their names. If their names were actually both Yenuka, did Rav Chisda name both of his kids Yenuka? And one of them was called, now again, if he gave both of his kids the same name, how do you know who's who? So they called one of them Mar Yenuka or Mar Kashisha. You know, older, right? I'm sorry, if you name them both Mar, name them both Mar. One was called older Mar, one was called younger Mar, or that, no, they had different names. Just one was known as the older son, one was known as the younger son. Okay, just as an aside. So the Gemara says, so what happened? So the two sons of Rav Chisda said to Rav Ashi, Zimna chada ikla Amemar le'asr. So this is very interesting. One time, the great sage Amemar came to our city. V'lo havra lan chamra. Both say getting to a great sugya now. And when Amemar came, we did not have wine. We ran out of wine. I sina le shikra. So both say this was by Havdalah. We didn't have any wine. It was time to make Havdalah. So we brought Amemar beer. Shechra, Rabbi say now again, just what's important to understand, the beer that the Gemara talks about, is generally date beer, right? Remember, so this a few weeks, not even a few weeks ago, I think last week, right? Bavel had Baruch Hashem surplus of dates, right? So beer was date beer. Even in Eretz Yisrael, beer was date beer. Okay, so they brought him beer. V'lo avdil. So Amemar refused to make Havdalah over beer, and therefore ubas tavas. And therefore I will say he went to sleep fasting. See, because we spoke about the halach, you're not supposed to eat before Havdalah. The only exception is water. Good. So you could drink water before Havdalah, but otherwise, again, no eating before Havdalah. So therefore, Amemar needed to make Havdalah. He didn't want to make Havdalah on beer, so he went to sleep fasting. Rashbam says over here, Bas Tavas lan mu'una shelo achav ukrahu b'diniyah. So we'll say this Bas Tavas is just a pasuk. It's taken from Daniel. Fine. So what happened? So the Gemara says, Bas Tavas. Lemachar tarachna va'aisina lechamra va'avdu v'tamid. The next morning, we managed to get Amemar some wine. He made Havdalah and then he ate something. Good. Fine. That's part one. Next part of the story, the Shana. Next year, Amemar came back to our city. So the Shana su'ikla la'asrin lo havalan chamra. Once again, we ran out of wine. Now, we'll say, Now, B'Pashas, it doesn't mean they never had wine, but remember, it's Matzah Shabbos. It must have been a really good Shabbos, right? So by the time Shabbos is over, there's no wine left. So same thing, what ends up happening? I seen the Shichre. We brought a Meimar beer for Havdalah. So we'll say now, this is the second time this is happening. Meimar says, Ihachi, now I see, if this is the second time you're bringing me beer, Chamar Medinahu. That obviously beer, Chamar Medina Bose means a drink of the nation. That ultimately, again, it's clear to me that beer, ultimately, again, is a chashav, a drink in this location. Look at the Rashbam for just a moment. Chamar Medina. So remember again, Chamar Medina literally means what? Means a wine of the country. Chamar is wine. So wine of the country, what does this mean? Rashbam says, Ein yayin achar be'ir hazos, kiyem sheichar. Hilchach mavdilin bo v'chein halacha. So we'll say, what Ameimar is saying is the fact that when you run out of wine, you bring beer, indicates that halacha l'maisa in this locale, beer, I'm not going to say it's as chashuv as wine, but is in the category of wine. That ultimately, again, when looking for wine replacements, beer is brought. So we'll say this is the concept of a Chamar Medina, which is a drink which has prominence in a particular locale. So finish the Rashbam. He says, Ein yayin achar be'ir hazos, when there's no wine in this city, kiyem sheichar, hilchach mavdilin bo. Therefore, Meimar said, now that I see that it's a Chamar Medina, ultimately, again, I should finish line of the Gemara, avdil v'ta'amid. Meimar made Havdalah over it, and then he had balava malka. Then he ate right afterwards. So now go back to the Rashbam for just a moment. So Rashbam says, Hilchach mavdilin bo, v'chin halacha. And the Rashbam says, this is the halacha, that you could use a Chamar Medina ultimately for Havdalah. Now the Rashbam says something very interesting, is Avamayim lo ikru Chamar Medina, but water is never called Chamar Medina. Ve'in mavdilin al hamayim afilo heicha dalaka sheichar v'yayin. And we don't make Havdalah even in a situation where there's nothing else to drink. Even when there's no beer, even when there's no wine, we don't use water. So we'll say, here we get into the topic of Chamar Medina, which is the ability under certain circumstances to substitute some other chashuv drink for wine. So we'll say, back to the Gemara. Shmamina tlas. So we learn from here three things. Number one, Shmamina hamavdil b'tila tzarach shav dalakos. We'll say, so number one, we learn that Allah chalamaisa, even if you made Havdalah in Shmona Esrei, Atachan Antanu, you still have to go ahead and make Havdalah ala kos, on a cup of wine. Right? We'll say, because again, remember, Bepashtos, Ameimar's davening Mariv, right? He's saying Atachan Antanu, yet there's still a din of Havdalah. That's lesson number one. Lesson number two, Lesson number two, you can't eat before you make Havdalah. Good. Ushmamina, Mishalo Hivdil B'Matzei Shabbos Mavdil V'Holech Kol Shabbos Kulo. So we'll say, so again, number one, Ameimar David Ma'ariv, yet he still needed to make Havdalah ala kos. That's lesson number one. Lesson number two is if you don't make Havdalah, you can't eat. Where do we learn that? Because remember again, Ameimar went to sleep hungry in year number one. He wouldn't make Havdalah on beer. And lesson number three is if you don't make Havdalah on Matzei Shabbos, you can make Havdalah on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. Then I will say, interestingly enough, what lesson is missing from the Gemara over here? What doesn't the Gemara say? That you could use Chamar Medina, right? Isn't that like, so look at the Rashbam, this is very interesting. Shmami Natzla, so the Rashbam says, Gimel Dvarim B'Sidrei Havdalah, V'afa Gav D'Shamina Mineim B'Demavdilan Al Chamar Medina. Even though, again, one of the major takeaways from this, so listen, this is going to be our topic now for a little bit, is that you can go ahead and use Chamar Medina, Afa Pisha Eno, Yayin Lo Chashiv Delo Iri B'Seder Havdalah. So we'll say, so into the Rashbam says, what the use of Chamar Medina, so what Rashbam says the Gemara is focusing on are the actual mechanics of Havdalah itself. So if you look at the three lessons that the Gemara learns, you have to make, even if you'd made Havdalah, and davening you have to make Havdalah ala kos. You can't eat unless you made Havdalah. You can make Havdalah during the week. The Rashbam posits, the Gemara is only focusing on lessons that deal with the mechanics of Havdalah. The concept of Chamar Medina, as we're going to see, is not unique to Havdalah. The concept of Chamar Medina is a din on what can you use as a wine substitute in general by a koshel bracha, but it's not havdalah specific. Because havdalah specific, therefore again the Gemara doesn't make this one of the lessons. So Rashbam goes on, he says, the havdalah inami milsa the pshitahu techayvan de yain achar beir tovlo sheyavdil ala shechar midol yavdil klas. Rashbam says one of two reasons as to why the Gemara does not include the lesson of Chamar Medina as one of the takeaway lessons. Either number one, because Chamar Medina is not related to the mechanics of Havdalah, and the lessons being espoused here have to do with the mechanics of Havdalah. That's possibility one. Possibility two is that it's a milsa de pshita. It's so obvious. It's so obvious that you could use Chamar Medina. The Gemara does not feel the need to articulate it as a lesson. Okay, fine. We'll say, so interestingly enough, so now what the Gemara highlights for us is the ability to go ahead and use a Chamar Medina for Havdalah. Now we'll say, we're going to see that halacha l'maisa, the discussion regarding Chamar Medina is really broken up into three parts. Chamar Medina by Havdalah, Chamar Medina by Kiddush, and Chamar Medina by Birkas Hamazon, by benching. And the truth is, they're all dealt with a little bit separately. So let me focus you on Havdalah for just a moment. So the Shulchan Aruch here says in Reish Tzadik Vav Sif Gimel, Im ein lo yain velo shechar ushar mashkim yesh omrim. I'm sorry, no. Ve'im mavdilan ala pas. I'm sorry. This is in Reish Tzadik Vav Sif Beis. Yeah, Reish Tzadik Vav Sif Beis. So listen to this. So the Shulchan Aruch writes, Ve'im avdilan ala pas. You can't make Havdalah on bread. Now, why does the Shulchan Aruch need to say this? Because as I just mentioned before, Kiddush and Havdalah are sister concepts, right? They're bookends. So you might have thought the same way you can make Kiddush on bread, that you make Havdalah on bread. Therefore, the Shulchan Aruch says, no. We don't make Havdalah on bread for a variety of different reasons, which we're not going to get into right now. However, aval ala sheichar bavdilin, imhu chamar medina, v'hu adin l'shar mashkin chutz min hamayim. So both say saloch l'maisa, but you could go ahead and make havdalah on sheichar, on beer, or on anything else that is a chamar medina chutz min hamayim, with the exception of water. Then I both say, so here's what's interesting about this. So the Ramah says, Haga, the tov yoser lahavdal kos pagum shal yayin al sheichar. So let's listen to this. Interestingly enough, so the Ramah says, it is better to use a cup of wine that is pagum than to use a chamar medina. Very interesting, right? So we saw yesterday, you can't use a kos that's pagum. Ramah says if it's a choice between a pagum wine and chamar medina, better to go ahead and use wine. So we'll say the Mishnah Berurah comments on this. He says, Al sheichar mavdilin, im ein lo yayin, vim yesh lo yayin, hu kodem l'chala mashkin. So we'll say this is actually very interesting. So the idea, just so you should understand, of chamar medina is that it's always second best. It's always second best. So whenever one could use wine, it is highly preferable to use wine for Havdalah. For Havdalah, we're going to see this is going to be true for everything, but for Havdalah as well, one should preferably use wine. If one doesn't have wine, then one could go ahead and use a chamar medina. I will say, interestingly enough, there seems to be one exception to this. Ubiyom tov shechalios he goes ahead. V'nogu lahavdil b'matzei Pesach al sheichar v'lo al yayin mishum dechaviv alav. The Ramah says, however, the minhag on matzei Pesach is to make havdalah on beer. Right? Why is the minhag on matzei Pesach to make havdalah on beer? Because again, remember, the Ramah is not referring to date beer. Right? This is good old chametz beer. Right? Because it's chaviv. Because you haven't had it for 8 days. Therefore, it's especially chabit. Okay, so we'll say, so this idea of chavivos is an interesting one, but again, I just want to point out something very important, which is that really me'ikar adin, one should try to go ahead and use wine for Havdalah. This is important. Now again, if one doesn't like wine or one doesn't normally drink wine, of course, you can use a chamar medina, but again, assuming one drinks wine, it's definitely preferable to use wine for Havdalah. Chamar medina is there as a runner-up beverage. Just as an aside, Rav Moshe has an interesting tshuva where he discusses halacha l'maisa. What's the definition of a chamar medina? So Rav Moshe's very interesting. He says anything that you would serve to company, anything that you would serve to guests, has the status of a chamar medina, which, by the way, is pretty expensive if you think about it. So, for example, he says soda could be a chamar medina, juice could be a Chamar Medina. Again, anything in the water family, so let's say again, seltzer, right, or sparkling water, as much as you would serve that to guests, comes into the water family, and water clearly is not a Chamar Medina. So again, at least by Havdalah, ideally still best to use wine, but in the event that one does not have wine, one could go ahead and use the Chamar Medina ultimately for Havdalah. Let's go weiter. Says the Gemara. What about using Chamar Medina for Kiddush? Right? So I want to make Kiddush over beer. Is that permitted? So the Gemara says, so remember again, we keep saying this, Shichra, whenever the Gemara refers to beer, their beer is date beer. You're going to see why this is important in just a moment. So Amar, so remember again, this is what Rav Huna asking from Rav Chisda. So Rav Chisda said, Uma Amar, Hashta, Uma Pirzuma, Utiini, Va'asani. But when it comes to, what are these things? Look at the Rashbam. So Pirzuma is Sheichar Sa'orin, beer that is made from barley. Ti'ini is beer that is made from figs. And asani is some type of berry beer. Asani, Rashbam says, Sha'osin Sheichar Miprisne. Kigon Tusin. So a beer made from berries. A beer made from berries. V'alalu chashuvin yoser mistam sheichar shalom shem shel tamam. Now, both say the chap of these beers is they were considered to be more chashuv than just stam date beer. Stam date beer. So the Gemara says. So therefore, Rav Chisda says when it comes to these, we'll call these specialty beers. The Gemara says the boy minei merav v'rab merebchia v'rebchia merabi v'lo pashet le. That it was asked about these beers if you could use them for kiddush, and yet it was never answered. Shichra mi boy. So Rabbi said, go sonars, if we're not clear that you could use specialty beers, which are more chashuv, then certainly you can't use regular date beer. Savar mine, kiddushe hudlo mekachin ale. So we'll say, it sounds like what they were concerned about was about using these beers for kiddush. Aval avdule mavdalinon. But it sounds like maybe you can use them for avdallah. Amalu Rav Chisda hachi amarav, kishem shein mekachin alav, Kach in mavdilan alav. Rather, Rav said the same way that you can't use beer for kiddush, you also can't use beer for havdalah. Say itmar nami. We learn this as well. Amar Rav Tachlifa Baravimi Amar Shwabo. Say first wide line. Kuf Zayin Amud Aleph. So the Gemara says Amar Shmuel Kishim Shein Makachin alav. Kachin mavdilan alav. So we'll say in this version, Shmuel says the same way that you can't use a Chamar Medina for Kiddush, you also can't use a Chamar Medina for Havdalah. So the Gemara, Levi, Shadar Le Rebbe, Shichra Bartleisar Migne. So Levi one time sent to Rebbe a beer, but it was a Bartleisar Magni, literally means that was, if you look at the Rashbam, Tleisar Magni, Shenasar Amayim ala Tmar v'achar ala Tmar machirim, that a beer that essentially was made with 13. How do you make date beer? You soak dates in water. There were 13 batches of dates that were soaked in the water. So it was a very strong, flavorful beer. A 13 date batch beer. Tame. So what happened? So Rebbe tasted it. Have basim tuva, and it was very delicious, very tasty. Amar ki gonzu ra'i lekadish alav velomar kol shiros v'sishbachos sheva olam. So we'll say there's actually quite a rating, right? Quite a review that Rebbe's giving this beer, right? So we'll say, so Rebbe said, Mamish, this beer is not only delicious, but it is fit for kiddush. And all of the shiros v'sishbachos, every single praise in this world could be recited over this beer. Pretty incredible. Ba'layla tzare, that night, he had significant diarrhea. I will say, so remember again, we've seen this reaction to specifically Babylonian date beers. Probably dates in general could act as a laxative. So we'll say, so the idea is that night he suffered significantly. Amar Misran Umafai. So he was said, how could something so delicious cause so much pain? It's a yesod, an incredible yesod in life in general. Sometimes again, things that appear to be very delicious and very wonderful turn out to cause a lot of pain. So we'll say, so therefore, fine. So we'll say, so again. So what's interesting about this is Rebbe was clearly of the opinion, at least initially, leaving aside the reaction that his body had to the beer that night, but at least initially felt that this beer should be usable for both Kiddush and Havdalah. Amar Yosef, Adra barabim delo ishti shichra. So what's this? Rabbi Yosef said, I'm going to take a public vow that I will not drink beer. Now what does this mean? So once again, you have Rav Yosef saying that halacha l'maisa, beer is so detrimental to the system that literally I'm going to take a public vow. Now again, this is a bit hyperbolic, but remember again, a neder shehudra al das rabim, right? A vow that is made in public can't be revoked. So what he was saying is, I'm going to make an irrevocable vow that I'm never going to drink beer. Okay, so Amarava ishti meiziruyon velo ishti shichra. I'd rather drink flax water than drink beer. So we'll say, so once again, this is talking about the fact that beer has this detrimental effect physically. Vamarava, tihoi shikiyusa shechra man de mekadesh ashechra. So we'll say, this is very interesting. So Rava says, tehavi sakiyuse shechra means, let a person make his money from beer if a person makes kiddush on beer. Now what does that mean? Take a look at the Rashbam. It's at the end of the first white line. Tehave sekiyuse shechra. Ani yihiyeh shelo yuchal liknos yayin mida keneged mida. So we'll say the idea being that a person should become so impoverished that all he could afford is beer if he makes kiddush on beer. So we'll say the idea being, Rav is saying it's not appropriate to make kiddush on beer, and one who compromises the holiness of kiddush by making kiddush on beer should only be able to afford beer. Okay, Rav Ashkechei, Rav Huna the Kadesh Shichra. Rav one time found Rav Huna making kiddush on beer. Amar le shari abba le mikne istere mishichra. So so literally he gave him a little bit of a shtak. He said it appears that Abba has become a beer merchant, is doing business with beer. In other words, he was saying the fact that you're making kiddush on beer must indicate that now you're in the beer business, because why else would anyone go ahead and make kiddush on beer? If you look at the Rashbam, he says over here, Shari le Abba, hischil lasos shechar, ulestaker bo, v'yafa beinecha mekadesh at ta'ala. Fine, Tan Rabbanan, in mikachin ela. So we'll say, so again, interestingly enough, you begin to see a lot of beer tension. So remember again, we started this with Ameimar, ultimately recognizing that beer could be considered a Chamar Medina, and at least for Havdalah purposes, we find Ameimar ultimately making Havdalah on beer. But then you find these other opinions having some significant reservations about the use of beer. So Tan Rabbanan, in Mikanchin ala Shechar, you can't make Kiddush on beer. Mishum Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon Amru, Mikanchin. So ultimately again, but others say, alright. So I'll say Amru Mikanchin. Matimas yain kolshu. So we'll say, so again, first machlokas is, can you use beer for kiddush? Next, matimas yain kolshu. We'll say, when going ahead and drinking from the wine of kiddush, all you require is a little bit of a taste. Look at the Rashbam. Matimas yain kolshu. Osatima sha'amru hamrashi yitom saratima b'kolshu. So it's a different topic now, right? So first statement was that you could go ahead and make kiddush on beer. Fine. Second statement was matimas yain kolshu. Ultimately, again, so first of all, machlokas, can you use beer for kiddush or not? Next, when you go ahead and you taste from the wine of kiddush, how much do you have to drink? First opinion said all you need is a taste. Rabbi Yossi Amar Yehuda Omer Mali Lugmav. No, you need a cheekful. A cheekful. Omer Rav Huna, Omer Rav, v'chein Tani Rav Gidel, v'chein Tani Rav Gidel demin narash. Hamekadesh v'ta mali lugmav yatsa. V'im lav lo yatsa. So I'll say again, Rav comes along and quotes Rav Gidel from Narash, who says that when you make kiddush and you taste, you must drink at least a cheekful. If you drank a cheekful, then you are yotze, but if not, you are not yotze. And in fact, if you take a look at the Rashbam says, v'tam mali lugmav yatsa, v'im lav lo yatsa, v'hachi hilkasa, v'hu shelo tam echad mikol mesubin, aval tam echad mehem yatsu kulan yidei chavasa b'shelo tam. Rav says, and this is very important, this is the halacha l'maisa. You have to drink a cheekful from kiddush. Right? You have to drink a cheekful. Now, we assume in halacha, cheekful is a row of revius, is the majority of a revius. To be on the safe side, a person should drink a revius from kiddush. Now, interestingly enough, the halacha by kiddush is, it doesn't have to be the mekadosh, right? It doesn't have to be the person who's making kiddush who drinks the wine. As long as it's someone who's being yosei with kiddush who drinks, that is satisfactory. Rabbi said this is very important because halacha l'maisa, someone has to drink a cheekful. So right, if a person makes kiddush, they just take a sip and then they give everybody else a sip. It's possible that one is not really Yotzei Kiddush. So someone, that's why ideally it's preferable that it's the Mevarich, drinks a cheekful of the kos, and one is Yotzei Kiddush in that way. And if not, again, the Gemara says you're not Yotzei. Amrad Nachman bar Yitzchak, Ana Tanina la lo gidul bar Menashe v'lo gidul bar Menyumi ele gidul stama. In our version of this, the author of this statement is not Gidl Bar Menashe, not Gidl Bar Menyumi, just regular Gidl. That was his name. So the Gemara says, Lamai nafkamin, who cares? In other words, what does it matter which Gidl it is? I'll tell you why. The Gemara says, Lamirma didei adidei. It's important, ultimately, again, because this way, if Gidl said something else, somewhere else, that was contradictory, ultimately, again, we have the ability to contrast these two statements. Good. So we'll say, so again, this, as I mentioned before, so again, we're still not clear about the whole beer piece, right? The whole beer piece, again, I'm not gonna, if we have time at the end of the shir, I'll go back. I showed you by Havdalah, we'll have to see what the halacha by Kiddush is, and the halacha by Kosher Bracha, let's say by benching is. So we'll come back to Amir Hashem. But at least for Havdalah, we've seen, you can use Chamar Medina, but halacha l'maisa, Chamar Medina is a b'diavad, right? Much better to go ahead and use wine for Havdalah. When we're making Kiddush, or for that matter, again, any kosher bracha, one should drink a mali lugmav. Now again, lav dafka that it has to be the mevarich. It could be one of the other people who's being yotzei with that kosher bracha as well. But someone has to drink a cheekful. Let's go back again. I owe you the Chamar Medina by Kiddush and by Ber Kasamos, and I haven't forgotten. Let's just make sure we can get through the daf first. Samach L'Mincha. What about the? So we'll say now going back to the Mishnah. So remember again, we'll say how do we start? Arvei Pesachim Samach L'Mincha Lo Yochel Adam Asher Techshach. You have to stop eating Samach L'Mincha. I know Samach L'Mincha means a half hour before Mincha. What don't I know? Ibaylahu. Samach L'Mincha Gidola Tanan Odum Samach L'Mincha Kitana Tanan. We'll say which mincha are we talking about? So remember again, just for illustrative purposes, on our perfect day, where sunrise is 6, sunset is 6. Mincha Gidola, 6.5 hours into the day will be 12:30. Mincha Kitana is 9.5 hours into the day will be 3:30. Samuch means a half hour before. So the Gemara is asking over here, is the Mishnah telling me that I have to stop eating at 12 or at 3? What is it telling me? So the Gemara says, let's analyze. So the Gemara says, Samach mincha gidola. If you tell me it's mincha gidola, you're telling me I have to stop at 12. Or mishum pesach, dama asi lemimshach amad beis, the asi leemnui mele ave pischa. Because you will say, maybe the concern is as follows. Maybe what the Mishnah is telling me is, you really have to stop eating at 12 o'clock in the afternoon. Because we'll say, remember again, what occurs at Chatzos on Erev Pesach? Ultimately, again, you could offer up the Karban Pesach. So what's the concern? Maybe Chazal were concerned that if we allow you to sit down to a meal, any time from 12 o'clock and on, what's going to end up happening? You're going to end up getting caught up in your meal, and you may forget to offer up the Karban Pesach. Maybe that's the concern. And therefore, when the Mishnah says you can't eat Samach L'Mincha literally means that halacha l'maisa from 12 o'clock and on Erev Pesach, you cannot eat. The other possibility is Samach L'Mincha Kitana Tanan. No, maybe halacha l'maisa, the mincha they're talking about is mincha kitana. It's mincha kitana. You have to stop eating from 3 p.m. and on, a half hour before mincha kitana, 3 p.m. and on. Umishum matzah dilma asi lemichle lematzah achila gas. Because what's the concern? We want you to stop eating at 3. Because what's going to happen if you don't stop eating at 3? You're going to continue eating up until Yom Tiv, and by the time Pesach comes, you're going to be full. You're going to sit down to the Seder, and you're going to be stuffed, and the matzah is going to be achila gasa. We don't want you to have matzah, achila gasa. Shabbos says, you hear the tension? So the Mishnah is telling you have to stop eating before Mincha. Is it before Mincha Gidola at 12 p.m.? And therefore the Mishnah is telling me we don't want you to eat a meal, lest you forget to offer up the current Pesach. Or no, it's Mincha Kitana. And the Mishnah is telling me we don't want you to eat past 3 p.m. because we want you to have an appetite for matzah. Sam Ravina Toshma. So Ravina said, Afilu Agrippas Hamelach. This halacha applies to even King Agrippas. So we'll say, Shuragil Lech Obatesha shows. So Agrippas would normally eat his first meal at 9 hours into the day. Now take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. So the Rashbam says, Agrippas HaMelech, Melech kasher haya, mimalchei Chashmonai, v'lo haya ochel ad shates. So we'll say, Agrippas, now this is actually very interesting. So the Rashbam says, Agrippas was a Melech kasher, a good guy, a good man, mimalchei Chashmonai. Ultimately, again, from the Hasmonean kingdom. Right, from the Hasmonean kingdom. Now, listen to this. Now, if you look at Tosas says, Afilu Agrippas HaMelech, Perush Hashbam, Melech kasher, ubimnei Chashmonai haya, v'lo dak. Tosas says Rashi didn't do his homework. Rashi didn't do his homework. Why? Because what does the Gemara Masechah Sota say? The Besota Amri kishegia lemikerev achecha tasim alech hamelech zolgu einav demos. Agrippas wasn't Jewish. Right, there's a whole discussion again about Agrippas. Remember, I will say this is very important. The Hashmonai family was wiped out by Herod, right? Herod was a Hasmonean slave, right? Or a slave to the Hashmonai family, and he wiped out the entire Hashmonai family. Each of the Gemara tells except for one girl, right? One woman in the Hashmonai family who Herod fell in love with. She, after she saw what Herod did to her entire family, she went up to the rooftop, she cried out, I am the last remaining member of the Hashmonai family. Whoever claims to be of Hasmonean descent after me is really a slave, and she threw herself down to her death. She committed suicide rather than marry Herod. Herod then rebuilt the Hasmonean dynasty, quote unquote, rebuilt the Hasmonean dynasty, but it was not the Hasmonean dynasty. It was a slave dynasty. Agrippas was a descendant. Agrippas was a very good man, and a very good king to the Jewish people. But Tosafos says, Rashi, you're wrong. He was not Mibeis Chashmonai. That is inaccurate. That is false. He was not Mibeis Chashmonai. I will say, the raya to this was that the Gemara Masechah Sota speaks about a story that was happening during Hakel, right? In Sukkot after Shemitah, when they assemble everybody in the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, and they read sections of the Torah, and they read Mikerev Achecha, Som Tasim Alecha Melech Mikerev Achecha, place a king amongst your brethren, and amazingly enough, Agrippas began to cry. Why did he begin to cry? Because he realized that he was not Mikerev Achecha. So Tosafos says, yes, he was a good man, but he was not Mibeis Malchus Chashmonai. Now again, that doesn't matter so much for our story. Agrippas was a pious man. Interestingly enough, he would eat his first meal at the 9th hour of the day. Now, what does that have to do with anything? Now, listen to this. The Gemara says, "Tamdei Chachamim eat their first." Also, we had this. Remember, we had this in Pesachim not so long ago. A little while ago. The different meal schedules, right? Everybody eats at different times in the day. So, Tamdei Chacham eat their first meal at the 6th hour of the day. Now, Agrippas. Now, if that's the case, why was Agrippas not eating his meal until the 9th hour? Oh, because royalty doesn't get up until 3 hours into the day. Royalty sleeps late. So Agrippas would sleep like royalty, but eat with piety. That's the way to live, right? Sleep like royalty, eat like piety. Right? So he would sleep until the 3rd hour, but he wouldn't eat his first meal until the 6th hour into the day after he woke up, which was hour number 9. So now watch this. The Gemara says, even Agrippas HaMelech, Osa Hayom, on Erev Pesach, Lo yochel ad shetechshach. He has to abstain from eating. To which the Gemara says, "I amrit b'shlama samach lemincha kitana tnan hainu rabuse." See, if you say samach lemincha means mincha kitana 3 p.m., then it makes sense that Agrippas is being included in this. Ela I amrit samach lemincha gidola tnan my rabuse da Agrippas chal iser alei meikara. But if you say samach lemincha means mincha gidola, then of course Agrippas can't eat. In other words, the shas iser for achila already occurred beforehand. Elo samach lemincha kitana tnan. Rather, you have to say that the samach lemincha is samach lemincha kitana. Sof, my rabuse da Agrippas, hamachile zmani surah. But I will say, again, still, I don't understand what is the chiddush about bringing in Agrippas. Nevertheless, again, by the time he goes ahead and wants to eat, it's going to be a shas iser. Ma'odetema, Teisha shows la Agrippas ka'arba shows done. You might have thought that the 9th hour of Agrippas is like the 4th hour for us, and therefore Agrippas HaMelech should be permitted to eat at 9 hours into the day. Because again, it's not going to make him too full for matzah. Therefore, again, Kamash Malo know that even Agrippas HaMelech would be bound by this halacha, even though again, his eating schedule is a little bit different than everyone else. So we'll say, Bottom line, halacha l'maisa, what the Gemara comes out is that samach lamin, again, it's a little anticlimactic for us because the Rashbam already said this in the Mishnah, but samach lamincha means what? Samach lamincha kitana. Halacha l'maisa, the Mishnah is teaching me, I cannot eat from 9 hours into the day and on. What's the reason? The Mishnah is not concerned that I'm going to become derelict with offering up the current Pesach. That we're not concerned about. Instead, the reason why we stop eating at 9 hours into the day is in order to enter into Yom Tiv with an appetite, specifically for matzah. And I'll say that's the halacha. Now listen to this, some interesting qualifications. Amar Rabbi Yossi, aval mat bi'alchu b'minei targima. Shabbos says, this is very interesting. You know, the burning question of what to eat on Erev Pesach has been one that has plagued the Jewish people, right, from the beginning of our national existence, right? What do you eat on Erev Pesach? Shabbos say, now watch this. Here's what's fascinating about this. Shabbos say, the Gemara just finishes saying you can't eat from mincha, from samach lamincha, from 3 o'clock and on. You know, I'll say, what does the Gemara say in the next sentence? But what can you eat? What can you eat? As if like it's impossible to contemplate the notion that maybe we won't actually eat anything. No. But what can you eat? So I'll say, now watch this. Now, we'll say, in all seriousness, we know, again, the Seder's late. Not only does the Seder begin late, but Lamaise, again, by the time you get to Shulchan Orech, or even by the time you get to Motzi Matzah, right? It's already late. So remember, so the Gemara says, okay, so now I understand you don't want me to eat from Samach Lamincha 3 p.m. and on, because again we should go into Pesach or go into Yom Tov with an appetite for matzah. But are there any exceptions? So listen to this. Amar Rabbi Yossi, aval mat bi'alchu b'minei targima. But you could dip minei targima. Now look at this. Look at the Rashbam for the moment. So this is in the wide lines of the Rashbam. We'll say 2, 4, 6, about 7 lines in. Mitabel va'ochel min hamincho l'malos. So we'll say this is talking about now food that you can eat from 3 p.m. and on, from Samach Lamincha and on. So what can you do? Targima, Rashbam says, Peros ubasar below lechem. So you can eat fruit, you can eat meat. The idea is you can't eat bread. Now, obviously bread doesn't mean bread over here because it's already after the Shas Esrei Chametz. No grain products. No grain products. That's the idea. Can't eat anything grain-based. V'hadinakit mitabel shekol machal hayde tibel. So both say the idea that it mentions over here regarding dipping is only because they would normally dip their foods, right? But again, lav dafka didn't have anything to do with dipping. So the idea over here is that halacha l'maisa, you can go ahead and eat fruit, you could eat meat already again from mincha time and on, but no grain-based items. Rabbi Yitzchak matbil biyarki. Rabbi Yitzchak would eat vegetables. Rashbam says biyarka chaya ochel yark min mincha l'mayla lefi she'ena masbiya. Because ultimately, again, vegetables don't satiate. Don't satiate. Therefore, we eat. Now, look what the Rashbam says. It's actually quite interesting. He says, "V'nira be'enai demegara liba lemechal." So ultimately, again, the Rashbam says, by the way, vegetables actually often, not only do they not satiate, but they often make a person even hungrier, which Rashbam says is great. Is great because then you go into Pesach ultimately again with even a greater appetite. He's va'achal matzah l'tei avon yoser uleficha chaya ochel yerek v'lo chaya noi kim erva Pesach chedei lahamshich v'lechol balayla. So we'll say, so the Rashbam just points out over here that this Rabbi Yitzchak eating vegetables could serve one of two purposes. Either vegetables, so again, essentially you begin to see is minamincho l'mayla, you could eat basar, peros, yarki, fruit, meat, vegetables, just nothing grain-based. Nothing grain-based from mincha time and on. So Tanya, that supports this. Hashamish matbil bebnei me'ayin v'nosef ne'archen. Listen to this, what I'll say. A shamish, what else can you eat on Erev Pesach? You can eat kishka. You could eat kishka, right? You could take the intestines, and you get, well, now, and the truth is, it's not really our kishka, right? Because kishka that you buy today usually has some type of flour that's used as a binder. Here they're talking about, again, good old kishka, which was just straight up intestines. So you could go ahead, so the shamish could go ahead, and matul neme'ayin could go ahead and dip the intestines and give it before the archim. V'afal pishen, ra'yil davar, so we'll say, if you look at the Rashbam says over here, shamish, Matbil b'nei me'ayin, kilomar b'nei me'ayin shel behemos hanishchatos l'sudas Yom Tov. So this is taking the intestines of the animals that were shechted for Sudas Yom Tov. V'gam no sein mahem lifnei archin hamenuyin yachar ala Pesach. Kadesh yochlu matzo Pesach l'te'avon. O be'erva Pesach koy b'tosef to the Pesachim v'afilu min ha'mincha l'mayla. So again, the Shamish could go ahead and give me'amari. So the Gemara says, even though there's no raya for this, zecher l'davar, there's a pasuk that supports this practice. Shneimar niru lachem nir val tizru ala kotzim. Literally, again, make for yourself a proper furrow and do not plant your seeds on the thorns. Now, what does this mean? If you look at the Rashbam says, so we'll say the Gemara is transitioning a little bit over here and pointing out that even sometimes eating certain things not only doesn't satiate, but ultimately again has the ability to even make you hungrier. So we see this content by vegetables, and apparently even certain types of meat, like eating the intestines, apparently again not only doesn't satiate, but actually makes a person even hungrier. So the Gemara says, quotes this pasuk, "Tichsev niro lachem nir, hera lanu hanavi dugma shecharshnes akarka kadei lekabalas hazriya." So we'll say the idea being is you go ahead ve'eno charusha ina mekabalas hazriya. So we'll say the idea of niro lachem nir means make for yourself a furrow in order to plant the seed. If you don't make the furrow, the seed doesn't take root. So what's the idea? The concept ultimately is that sometimes even for achila, make yourself hungrier. So this way, again, the matzah will be even more delicious. So there are two ways you make yourself hungrier. Possibility number one is don't eat. Right? The possibility number two is eating certain foods which by definition instigate or amplify the appetite a little bit. So the idea over here of the shamish serving the bnei ma'im, the intestines beforehand, is way that they were megarer achila. They intensified the appetite. So we'll stop over here. Will the Meretz Hashem pick up with the rest of this discussion about, again, what to do on Erev Pesach and Meretz Hashem tomorrow. And I still owe you Chamar Medina, ultimately, again, by Kiddush and by Kosher Bracham. To be continued. Shkach Bosei.